I'm going to present something which starts very, very far away in the United States. And then you're going to tell me what you're going to do with that afterwards, right? Yeah. Like, you know, it's going to be viral, right? My kids never say, "Oh, I saw that video of you, Daddy." Never. Somehow there's like 3 people watch it, and they're always in Charleston. I also want to say there are a few very good friends of mine here, and it's really a pleasure to see you and appreciate the effort as well. Students, friends, etc. Okay, so we're going to talk about America, then we're going to talk about Israel, and then maybe, without knowing a lot, be able to think a bit more specifically about this milieu, about this particular constituency or multiple constituencies, but very minimally, and that'll just really be a way to encourage other people to think about it more specifically. So we're going to start with me presenting a thesis which is at the basis of this book. It's called Beyond Sectarianism, the Realignment of American Orthodox Judaism, which was published 2 years ago. Was very privileged to get this National Jewish Book Award. So hopefully, even if this is irrelevant to you, it'll be interesting because other people thought it was interesting. So that's, lishma, as they say, right? But actually now, because people like this book, I decided that I should write sort of a sequel. And the sequel is the relationship between American Orthodox Judaism and Israeli society and Israeli religion. So in a sense, this lecture segues very nicely with some of the things that I'm trying to think about. And interestingly, just on a methodological level, what I find is that it's always good to step away in order to think about something. So I grew up in the United States, but I've been living in Israel for nearly 30 years, and I'm sort of an insider-outsider. I travel the United States a lot, but I found that I know that world. Nonetheless, because I'm sort of outside of it, I maybe have a little bit different perspective than some scholars who are sitting right in the midst of things. Similarly, maybe my going away to the United States for a couple months will give me some sort of distance and facilitate understanding Israeli society in ways that when I'm living it are sometimes more challenging, more difficult. Okay, so what did I do in that book? What I did was I looked at scholarship about American Orthodox Judaism and what were the prevailing understandings of this community from an historical and a sociological perspective. And then I looked at a lot of empirical or case study data that I had collected through various studies, articles, things that I've been working on over the last 15 or so years. And I came to the conclusion that the prevailing understanding of that spectrum or community was not the way people had thought. In other words, there were certain points of departure for scholarship and for rabbis and for communal organizations and for fundraisers and for all sorts of institutions. This is what American Orthodoxy is. These are the groups, these are the different sectors, etc. This is what characterizes them. And my conclusion was that it wasn't quite the way it once was. It was a little bit different, and those nuances, or more than nuances, were significant. And really what I came to show in the book was those differences, and that in order to understand American Orthodox Judaism today, one needed to be aware of those things. Now I'm going to do something which is very not Sherlock Holmes or John le Carré oriented, which is I'm going to tell you from the get-go what I said, and then you can go to sleep. But I like to put it all on the table and then just display it. Basically what I said was that the distinctions between what we call modern Orthodoxy and Haredi or Yeshivish or Black Hat, however we want to describe it, those two sectors which were sort of very clear to people, and that was the point of departure for looking at American Orthodoxy, those distinctions were no longer so exacting or so accurate, and there was a lot more of a hedge, a lot more of a continuum between those different groups when you get into the 1990s and into the 21st century. And what I tried to show was that the modern Orthodox, at least a lot of them, are less modern Orthodox according to the criteria that were once used to define someone as modern Orthodox, and that quite a few of the Haredim weren't quite as Haredi as was once the lists that were used in order to define those people as Haredi. And therefore, sort of, you could still find the far points in the spectrum where people were very ideological in one position, but nonetheless, there was really a middle group which was on a continuum, and it was much harder, becoming much, much harder to distinguish between those sort of categories. Now, of course, it's just a caveat. Categories are always just that, they're categories and nothing. Every single person is different. Every individual is made up of all sorts of things and their backgrounds and their education, etc. We know that not just from history or sociology, we know that in psychology, we know that in all sorts of things. It's one of the most beautiful and important contributions of postmodern thought. Many people have a horrible time with postmodernity. There's no truth anymore. There's no absolutes anymore. There's no police anymore. It may be the case. But what postmodernity did do in the fields of psychology, in the fields of history, in the fields of many, many different areas is say, we can't, even when we do generalize, we have to be self-aware and recognize that these are generalizations and that every single person, every single community, every single institution has particularities, and that we're just trying to come up with typologies that can help us navigate the varieties without saying something absolute. So I think that's something that we should be aware of, and I'm very aware of that in my teaching. I'm very aware of that in my writing. Nonetheless, we do have to give our children names. We have to, get married. We have to take on citizenship. We do all sorts of things that are seemingly absolute, even though in reality we know that the fact that I am American, or I speak English, or I'm a male, or all sorts of things, those only define me in certain aspects. They may define me for a minyan in an Orthodox halachic setting, but they might not define me in the Israeli army today, because in the Israeli army today maybe you can be a tankist and be a female. In other words, it depends. But what you're defined as has limited meaning and not absolute meaning. But I think that should be, as they say, muvan me'elav. But I just wanted to clarify. So let's get back to American Orthodoxy. The starting point for anyone studying American Orthodoxy from a historical sociological point is an article that was written in 1965 by someone who was a mentor of mine. Maybe some of you studied with him or knew him. His name was Charles S. Liebman. He was initially professor in Illinois, then in Yeshiva University. In the late 1960s, he made Aliyah. He was one of the founding members of the political science department in Bar-Ilan University. He eventually received the Israel Prize, Pras Yisrael, and unfortunately passed away suddenly from heart failure about a year after that. He was a very special person, very insightful, and among the areas that he worked on was Orthodoxy. It wasn't the only one. And he wrote an article that was published in 1965, which was called Orthodoxy in American Jewish Life. In that article, he went through all the different groups of Orthodox affiliated groups in the United States, major personalities, historical development. He looked at both quantitative data, statistics, all sorts of things that were available, as well as looking more on a qualitative level at particular cases, case studies, etc. And he said, I think this is an article that's almost 90 pages. It was in the American Jewish Yearbook. But there are two major statements that come out of that article. Number one, until 1965, almost all the people who studied American Jewry said Orthodoxy is a dying relic of the immigrants who came to the United States, whether it be those who came in the early 20th century or those who came subsequent or around the time of World War too. But it's a relic. It's not relevant to America. There are people holding on to it, but it's not. It's not capable of adjusting, and it's just a matter of time before it disappears. The future of American Jewry is probably conservative Judaism. In the 1960s, conservative Judaism was in a very good place, as we know from statistics today. That's not, unfortunately, in my opinion, the case today. But at that point, the synagogue center, the suburban third settlement communities, Marshall Square wrote a lot about that, were really on the upswing, and conservative Judaism seemed to be keyed in to the mindset of third generation or second, third generation Jews in America. So number one, what Liebman said was that Orthodoxy is vibrant. Not only is it vibrant, it may be the most vibrant. And when you look at things that you might be familiar with, like the Pew study from a couple of years ago, and they just did another one in 2015 on Orthodoxy, he seems prophetic, which is, at least on a demographic level, I don't think statistics are ever all the story. And my friend Shaul over here is a little bit more of a statistics man, and I just wrote something about Pew that I said it only told part of the story, which is something that'll come up here. But having said that, at least in the numbers there, okay, it's clear that Orthodoxy in the upswing in many ways, and certainly conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism are very challenged, and that their intermarriage rates, their affiliation rates, etc., are declining. So in that way, Liebman, already in 1965, says Orthodoxy is vibrant, Orthodoxy is just going to grow, and in that way, he was going against the trend. As time went by, people agreed with him, and he really created sort of a subfield study of American Orthodoxy. The other thing he said was, well, who are these Orthodox Jews? That's the big question. Who are they? And what he said was, well, there are all sorts of types. We can basically divide them into two categories. The two categories are categories that he didn't make up. He took them from probably the father of modern sociology, Max Weber, the German sociologist, Protestant sociologist. He was the first to develop this concept of church and sect. He was talking about Christian religious groups, but these were typologies. He said that generally you can talk about two types of basic religious organisms. A sect is usually a narrow group that is entirely or basically fundamentally egalitarian. Not egalitarian in the, let's say, gender way that we talk about today. Egalitarian in the sense that everyone's on the same level. What it means by everyone's on the same level, it means everyone's on the same level of observance. Everyone's on the same level of commitment. People who are alike come together with similar values, similar commitments, similar levels of observance. It's often kind of a startup. It's a group that's in its nascent form, and it's a sect, right? It's the most extreme sects that we know here in Israel are like the Dead Sea sect, etc. that are well known to us. But it reflects a group which has extreme homogeneity. Extreme sense of we are devoted to the same things. What Weber said is that over time, sects don't usually sustain themselves, and they usually become more church-like. And what is a church? Church here is a sociological term. It's not a specific to Christianity. Church means a big tent. Church means that as a religion or a religious group grows, generally it creates a hierarchy where there are the leaders or the ultimate believers or practitioners who live according to an elite standard. But in order for a church to grow, in order for a church to reach out beyond its core group, it has to make room for more variety, more heterogeneity. It has to recognize that there is a hierarchy and there are those people in the elite, but there are people on multiple levels as well. Churches usually have more bureaucracies. Churches usually are more engaged with broader society. They're not enclavist. They're less closed off. They generally also develop more synthetic types of ideologies that integrate between their core religious ideals as well as the sort of the culture and the ideals of their surrounding society. So this was Weber's distinction. This was his typology. Liebman then took that, and like I often tell my students, there are a lot more people studying Christianity and Islam and in Hinduism than there are studying Jewish history or the sociology of Judaism. Now, these tools like a typology are not meant to say, it's just like that. I hate when I see social science research where they say, let's take a model and show how it fits in this. But on the other hand, sometimes you study things on like a close text reading, or you study a group and you sit in a synagogue for weeks and weeks and weeks, like months and months and months, like Samuel Heilman did years ago in his book Synagogue Life. And then you go back to sociological literature and you say, gee, that's interesting. Some of the things that these typologies talk about seem to describe the organism that I've just been meeting. So Liebman was that kind of social scientist. He didn't just say, take Weber and now, the reason I'm saying this is because when I describe it from Weber to Liebman, you think, oh, he just took the car and, you have to say there's a car, now there's a tire, but my tire is a little different than that tire, and let's see how we can adjust it so that it'll be relevant. Okay, I'm sorry if I'm being a little academic, but I don't know. I think it makes academic more serious and not just stuff made up when you realize people are aware of these things. Okay, because you could say anything. It's narrative. It's narrative. Okay, how are we doing on time, Daniel? Okay? Okay, you're my clock there. So Liebman said, there's one group called the modern Orthodox. They're the church Jews. And it wasn't pejorative. Why are they church Jews? Because they're mostly made up of people whose parents came to America somewhere between 1870 or 1880 and 1924 when they started to cut off the immigration. There are people who came to America because it was the Golden Medina. They came to America to make a better life for themselves. But as opposed to the majority of immigrants from those generations who were willing to compromise to a great extent on their religious observance, or even left the shtetl or their Yiddish Gasse in Eastern Europe in order to be able to get rid of the shackles of tradition. There was a core group of people who wanted to dance in two weddings at the same time, who wanted to be able to be both American and observant. And in order to do that, they worked very hard. They sacrificed a lot. They did things that some of them got fired every Friday because they weren't work on Shabbos, and some of them hardly ate out, because there was so little kosher food that they could trust, or they lived in outlying communities where they didn't have a mikvah, and they had to, all sorts of mesirut nefesh, tremendous, in order to maintain Yiddishkeit. And then as they became more established, they tried to create institutions that could sustain that type of life. So we talk about synthetic institutions that we're familiar with, but that emerged initially in the early 20th century, we'll say, or late 19th, early 20th century. Think about the Young Israel movement of synagogues. We're Americanized Orthodox synagogue. Think about the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America. Think about or the OU, which was originally started by graduates of Jewish Theological Seminary, which was sort of an Orthodox or not a conservative institution initially, because there wasn't conservative Judaism as we know it, but that's another story. Think about Yeshiva University. Think about the early day schools. Think about the Maimonides that was started by Ross Soloveitchik in 1937 and his supporters in Boston. Think about Ramaz, started by Joseph Lookstein in 1937 as well. The same period, pre-World War II. We're talking about second or third generation kids. They wanted them to be Americans, get the best secular education, go to the premier colleges. They also want them to meet other Jewish kids. They also want them to have a good skills in Hebrew, in Chumash, other texts as well, know how to pray, etc. So the church orthodoxy, that modern orthodoxy, is synthetic and it's Americanized. It's lichatchila, as we say, forthrightly American. That we can be Americans and we can be Orthodox, and we're going to create a way to do both of those things. We're going to be patriotic, we're going to be proud, and we can do that. Some would say that also entailed certain compromises on strictness of religious observance. May be the case, but fundamentally, their position was that Judaism is predicated on halakha. Having said that, from a demographic perspective, it was totally church orthodoxy from the perspective of Big Tent. In other words, Jeffrey Gurrock's written about that. He wrote an article called The Age of Non-Observance of American Orthodoxy. Up till 1960, if you went through the majority of synagogues, Orthodox synagogues across America, most of them, the majority of attendees, were not Sabbath observant. From 1960s, that starts to change dramatically, but that was the case. So that's church orthodoxy. Liebman says in 1965 that there's another burgeoning group, which he called sectarian orthodoxy, church sect. Today we would call them Haredi orthodoxy, or enclavist orthodoxy. This group really had some roots in the pre-World War II period, but its critical mass were the people who came as refugees from the rise of the Nazis to power in 1933, particularly from the late 1930s, Anschluss, the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Treaty, and of course the Blitzkrieg and the invasion of Poland, 1939, September 1st, 1939, etc. So the Holocaust in its entirety, if we'll call it that, led to thousands upon thousands of Jews making their way to the United States from the late 1930s, a little bit during the early 1940s, but after 1945 and onwards, very much, once again, 1956, with the political changes in Hungary and the influx of a large contingent of Hungarian Jews. And these Jews were different, not only than the masses of 3 or 4 million Jews who came between 1988 and 1924, but different than the Orthodox Jews who maintained their allegiance to Orthodoxy. These were people who were told and imbibed the idea that America was the Treifa Medina, that it was a place where people lost their faith and their commitment, and they stayed in Eastern Europe and thought that was the place where Yiddishkeit could thrive. Once their communities were destroyed, they had no choice. But they didn't come because they thought America was a promised land. They came because that was where they ended up for whatever reasons. Whether relatives, economics, etc. And when they came, they didn't say, oh, we want to create a synthetic, integrated American Orthodoxy. They said, we want to survive based on our religious commitment. If there's any ideal, it's the ideal of the shtetl, which is even an imagined ideal, using the term of Benedict Anderson. Whether that shtetl really existed ever or not is less important than that was the perception that the shtetl was the ideal Jewish community. And therefore, to recreate the synagogues, the yeshivas, most of all, the Hasidic the Hasidic courts, etc. Thank you. And these people were not interested in secular education. They were not interested in being American. They weren't interested in popular culture. They also weren't interested in being inclusive. And on the contrary, they were looking for ways to separate themselves from broader American Jewry and even separate themselves from broader American Orthodoxy. Because from their perspective, Jews who had been in America and the institutions and the lifestyle that had been created was poisoned, was polluted by American culture, and therefore had no future if we're talking about a thriving grassroots Jewish culture. So if you want to just take one illustration, Rav Aaron Cutler comes from Kletzky. He arrives in 1941 via the east to New York, and he was already a very well-respected Rosh Yeshiva in Eastern Europe, and he has some supporters, Irving Bunim and others in New York, and he decides that what America doesn't have is Torah. So he starts a little yeshiva in Westchester very quickly. He says Westchester is too close to New York. And he looks for a place that's close enough to New York so he can fundraise, close enough to New York that people aren't going to have to take planes, but far enough away that it's going to be able to be separate. And he finds Lakewood, New Jersey, which is a chicken farming community with a few hotels, but not a mainstream community. And he could basically take it over from a Jewish perspective. And he goes there in 1943, and when he died in 1962, there were 250 younger light, Kollel guys, most of them learning full-time. The rule was you cannot learn any secular studies. You come, if you're single, you have to stay single till the springtime when you get taken out, you let out of the freezer, then you can go on dates. Most of the guys are married people learning Torah full-time. And that yeshiva had 250 people when he died in 1962, when his son Rav Shneur Cutler took over. Shneur Cutler died in early 80s. By then, we're talking of over the high hundreds. Today, there are 7,000 full-time Avreichim, younger life, learning in Lakewood. Misnagdim, Lithuanian style, and Hasidim learning there. Different chaburas. If you ever want to learn about Lakewood, I spent a lot of time there. I can tell you a lot about it. It's a very interesting institution in and of itself. But the enclaves of Islam, that's the point. Sectarian orthodoxy, away from the Young Israels, away from YU, away from all these integrated synthetic types of areas where there's an acknowledgement that America is good. Now, Rav Aaron Cutler also was involved with Chinuch Hatzmai and all sorts of things that were more grassroots. But his ideal, his elite, the people that he saw as the future American Orthodox, the leaders, and the Balavatim were the people that he cultivated in Lakewood, and that the people came afterwards. So, these people want nothing to do with non-observant Jews. They want nothing to do with conservative Jews. They want nothing to do with modern Orthodox Jews. Not because they dislike them, but because they had a mission. Their mission in their self-understanding was to create a renaissance of Torah Jewry. And that meant staying clear. So there's many more details we can present, but Liebman, he said, in 1965, this is what we have. Both communities are thriving. In his opinion, and here's where he got it a bit mistaken in my opinion, the Haredim eventually were going to become more like the modern Orthodox, because you can't sustain economically, culturally. America is very strong for a variety of reasons, leadership. For a variety of reasons, he thought that over time the Haredim would become would not be able to maintain themselves. So he was right and he was wrong. He was right that they would be able to maintain them. He was right that they would become more like the modern Orthodox. He was wrong that they wouldn't maintain themselves. And that's what basically where sort of I come in. And now we'll move more to contemporary things. Okay. So, we'll move a little quicker. Okay. So, what I found over the last 15 years of traveling around the United States, visiting communities, going to kollels and going to synagogues and visiting Yeshiva University and speaking and interviewing people here and there and all over was that, for one, people who grew up in synthetic institutions, so-called church communities, in modern Orthodox communities, whose parents were educated in day schools, who went to Yeshiva University, many of them are less gung-ho about America, less gung-ho about American culture, less forthright in their commitment to a synthetic ideal, and also very, very intent on adopting what once was called an elitist standard of religious observance. A standard of observance that once upon a time was more associated either with rabbis and their wives or Haredim. So if you take the sort of the easiest external, hair covering. Or you can make it much easier. Take mikvah. Think about mikvah in the 1950s, 60s, and look at mikvah in the mikvah is standard now. Mikvah was not standard in the 1950s in America, even for modern Orthodox people. But if you take hair covering, if you take kashrut, if you take all sorts of mixed education, separate education, you take a lot of different things, the interaction between young men and young women, etc., that you have a strong group of people who institutionally grew up and maybe affiliated with modern Orthodox shuls, modern Orthodox institutions, who are today behaving in ways which were once more characteristic of the Haredim. And now I'll add to that something which I think, two things. One, we might be more aware of, one less. One is that I didn't make that up. Samuel Hyman's written about it, Chaim Wax has written about it, other people. And one of the things that people always talk about is the Israel experience. The year or 2 years in Israel of being away from the communities, of being under the influence of very charismatic teachers in a very holistic environment, and how that is a transitional or a sort of a moment for many, many young men and women where they come home and want to adopt the standard of the yeshiva when they come home. Now, another thing that I saw is more sociological. I don't know how many of you spend time in the United States today, but if you look at what would be called the strong modern Orthodox communities, sociologically what you see is, if I grew up in Riverdale. It was a pretty strong community. Then it's much stronger now. But I went to the JCC with kids who were not Orthodox or not necessarily even Jewish. I was involved in all sorts of activities beyond my day school and beyond my high school that made me sort of have exposure to a broad spectrum of people. When I visit my relatives and people I know in the 5 towns, in northern New Jersey, in other areas, what you see is there's very, very limited, even in people who get strong secular education, from a sociological perspective, very, very limited engagement, not in school, not in camp, not in chugim, not in almost any area, maybe in college, and even that is frowned upon in many circles, to people who are not like them. So from that perspective, even if a person is so strict in terms of Jewish law, sociologically, they've much less, unless, and specifically this is a New York phenomenon, in so-called out-of-town communities, it's less so, but even in certain, I spent time in Houston, I spent time in Los Angeles, I spent time, it's a large community, I spent time in Chicago. As communities go stronger, less and less involvement between even the modern Orthodox institutions and the broader Jewish community. Toronto. On the other side, what I found is that when there's 7,000 people learning in Lakewood, when the Haredi community from a population perspective is exploding, when there's a lot more wealth in that community than there was in the past, that there is actually increased engagement, not necessarily with the modern Orthodox, but especially with the non-observants. Taking that together with high levels of intermarriage and acculturation among the non-Orthodox, the whole industry of kiruv has exploded within not just Chabad, within the non-Hasidic or Haredi community. And it's not just about the one guy who goes out to Columbus, Ohio. It's kollels. It's the families of the kollels who come to visit and go to a bar mitzvah and are exposed. It's websites. It's I've done a lot of work on the Kiruv movement, and one of the key things that I've studied is how, even if you have 700 people leaving Lakewood or every year, and if only 100 of them or 50 of them go into Kiruv, but they all have 7 siblings or 8 siblings. They all have friends from yeshiva. They have they have a wife who has a family. And what happens is that there's much more of a sort of, by osmosis and by exposure, of involvement with broader society, not just engagement personally, but if you're going to talk to people who are non-affiliated Jews, you have to know the language, you have to know the web, you have to know sports, you have to know rock and roll or hip-hop. Today, I guess, would be more likely. You have to be conversing, you have to know Super Bowl. So when the Pittsburgh Kollel wants to do a fundraiser, the Pittsburgh Community Kollel does the annual Pittsburgh Golf Tournament. We're Kollel guys and funders, and everyone goes out to a fancy golf club and hits the greens. Okay? And that's just one among many examples. Another thing that I found out with the Kiruv movement is that you can't do Kiruv as single sex. In fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe learned a long time ago that the people who are most effective Kiruv workers are women. Now, we all have these discussions about the role of women, women's leadership, etc., etc. What it turns out is, without calling people rabbis, without talking about maharat, smicha, all these things, it turns out there's a whole cadre of female Haredi charismatic leaders, people like Lori Palatnik, if you've heard of her, who go out, who have websites, who are teaching mixed groups, who are having havrutas, male, female, sort of collective Beit Medrash study. So the whole Kiruv industry has a lot to do with a change in the character of the Haredi world in America. Number 2, and I see our time is limited, but I'll give 5 more minutes and then we'll get to Israel just a little bit. Okay, number 2 is that once upon a time, college was a no-no. Baltimore, they went to college. Chavetz Chaim, they sort of went to college. Everywhere else, you didn't go to college. Among the non-Hasidic colleges, so you can do it by internet. You could do it by doing some of the courses there. There are so many different options, but it is so clear that if you live in Passaic, or if you live in Flatbush, or if you live in Muncie, and you're not Hasidish, you're probably going to go to college. The women for sure, the men too. Big change. Third area, and this is very relevant, and it's a good way to move in, Zionism. We live in a post-ideological age. Zionism, yeah, I like Eretz Yisrael. I'm not against the Medina. I think it's a good place. I think there's more Torah in Medinat Yisrael than any other place in history. I think that there are a lot of really nice things. Zionism, well, that was like this secular ideology from that started in the 1890s or wherever, and there are a few people, holdbacks and some kibbutz up north that still buy into that, but Zionism, I mean, what ism really still is? There's no more communism, capitalism, we're in Tea Party, I don't know, whatever we are. Isms are out, John Lennon, remember, ism, all we are saying is give this chance. I don't know, whatever. It should be your time. But okay, anyone remember that? Yeah, okay. I like to have one pop reference. Yeah, okay. So, Zionism? Yeah, I'm not anti. So, basically, church, sect is helpful, but it's not really where things stand today. If you look at American Orthodoxy today, and one more thing is, and this is really interesting, that the rise of a hyper-liberal orthodoxy has caused a coalescence. In other words, because even people who are the leaders of so-called modern Orthodox institutions Rosh Yeshiva and YU, rabbis of major synagogues are not happy with some of the things, let's say, Rabbi Avi Weiss is doing in Chovei Torah or in Maharat. So what happens is you start seeing these petitions where you'll have people who are rabbis who are graduates of Ner Yisrael, Lakewood, Yeshiva University, Hebrew Theological College, Skokie, and Tells, all coming together. What do they agree upon? What people always agree upon, on the common enemy. The common enemy is the liberals. But you see, in groups that were one, Liebman would never see Agudas Yisrael and YU coming together against liberals or against homosexuals or against transgenders or against whether treatment is good. All sorts of things are bringing these groups that were once much more separate together. I'm not saying they were ever totally separate, but much more together. How is this relevant to us? Well, I think a lot of us come from that place, but we came here at different times. And without knowing too many of you individually, my guess is that this synagogue was established by people who, many of them, were nurtured in modern orthodoxy from we'll call it the church orthodoxy approach.
The age of the isms.
The age of the isms, maybe, but also the age where inclusion and engagement with a broad spectrum of Jews was a religious principle. It wasn't just, it just happens. I was like, if you grow up in Portland, Oregon, or if you grow up in Riverdale, or if you grow up in Teaneck, well, you're going to go to shul with the people from the men's club aren't going to be necessarily Shomer Shabbos. You can have a baseball league so everyone can play baseball together. And that was just sort of like, because this is what we want. This is part of what it means to be a Jew. Zionism was an ideology, and this is where you get to isms, that was part of religion. When religious Zionism didn't mean I'm a Zionist who is religious, that whether people are Kuknik, redemptive Zionists, or people are Soloveitchik, sort of the fate, Brit Koral, Brit Yehud, Zionists, going back to Kol Dodi Dofek. Whatever Zionism people from a certain generation, including myself, and I'm sort of maybe at the end of that generation, but people who grew up in that type of modern orthodoxy, when they came to Israel, they were inspired by the Medina as something that was a religious value. When they educated their children and chose institutions, it was institutions that were based on that. When they supported their children putting their lives on the line to volunteer or to be drafted and not to stay in yeshiva for a long time until they're married, it was because they believed that serving in the Jewish army was not just a matter of survival, but it was a matter of a moral religious value. And they created a synagogue, which maybe, I don't know how heterogeneous a shul ever was, but a synagogue where those values were fundamental to what it meant to, where Tfilat Yom HaAtzmaut, whether you say Hallel with a bracha or not, was an important moment. Where Bnei Akiva was a place where kids would be educated with a certain worldview. Where there was a sense that as an observant Jew, those ideas were inspiring, central, prominent. Now, there are still people who grow up that way in America. But it would appear from everything that I've seen that nobody learns Ivrit anymore. If you just turn just on the basic, if people went to Yeshiva Flatbush or to Maimazi or Ramaz or Highlight, where you learn Ivrit, where one of the values, why did people learn Ivrit? Because Israel, it was part of religious Zionism. It was part of that Ivrit, Hasafa HaModernit, is part of what it means to be Jew, going to Camp Masad or going to Morashah or places where Hebrew was a religious value. But moreover, the the generation that became adults in the late 1990s and in the 21st century in particular, a lot of the people who are very ideological, very committed to Eretz Yisrael, to Torat Yisrael, to living a holistic Jewish life which cannot be lived even in Brooklyn or Lakewood, right? Those are beautiful things. And I'm not being facetious. In other words, you want to live a total Jewish life? Come to Israel. But there's a difference between that, and it's not just a nuance. There's a difference between that and saying, I want to be part of the great Zionist experiment, and I want to put myself on the line economically, socially, family-wise, and in terms of my life, in order to be here. Now, everyone who lives here can get on a bus. We all know that. But that is something everyone hopes doesn't happen, what has happened in the past. So I think that when I look at certain segments of the Olim in this country, that I see that there's a disconnect. And it's not because one group is more committed and one group is less committed. It's not because one is more religious or less religious. It's because you're talking about groups that the core inspiration that brought them here was different. That's number one. And number two, that in terms of the hierarchy of priorities, even if people think, let's say I'm talking about the younger generation, that Israel's a good thing and there are good things about it, if you're comparing, let's say, getting the values of Bnei Akiva or of a Hezir Yeshiva as compared to my child being in a more enclavist environment, cheder, or a girls' school, or where there'll be less exposures to the less appealing parts of secular Israeli society, then when people have to choose priorities, if Zionism or identification with the state and the sense of being connected to the broader spectrum is less of a core, less of a fundamental aspect of their religious identities, then people take a different direction. Now, I don't know if what I described is accurate in terms of this specific community, but I imagine that if a community is trying to create some sort of amalgam with multiple generational groups, and those things are factors, those would demand a great deal of work and a great deal of willingness to compromise on all sides, whether it be founders or new people, but the ability to understand each other and to find ways in order to accommodate for the multiple groups such that people can still find those commonalities which can allow for something that is meaningful for everybody. That's a starting point. I'm happy for your attention. Thank you. And I'd be happy if people make some comments. Thank you very much.
I grew up in a community in Washington, Baltimore area where I went to day school and I went to high school. And over the years, and then my daughter went to the same school system that I went to, and the school system itself changed much more to the right than the philosophy that I grew up with. And I'm seeing this more and more in the United States and more in Israel. And that's a factor that plays into what you're saying, and how the communities are changing.
So I'm going to appreciate that support, but I'm just going to support you a little bit more. I'd be interested to ask people, and you please don't answer this, it's a rhetorical question, but how many people who would self-identify as modern Orthodox would encourage their children to be ramim in yeshivas and to be day school teachers and to dedicate themselves to being educators and to living the lower middle class life that often entails, and how many people would want their children to be at least as financially secure as they are and to live a more Borgani life and be able to be professionals, be able to live on the higher standard that has become the norm both certainly in America. And by the way, I mean, as you all know, and sometimes I would be interested in the younger people here. I don't know what your backgrounds and what you do professionally, but coming to Israel is also a financial decision. There's a lot of economic assimilation in America, or certainly economic. I mean, it depends where you live, but the amount of income that a person has to generate to do what's considered standard, which is send your kid to day school, send your kid to a Jewish camp, membership in the synagogue, and donations, gifts to weddings, bar mitzvahs, etc., is, I mean, if you look at the Pew study, the more interesting statistics are that the modern Orthodox have the highest average income of any of the categories of denominations in America. Because to be a modern Orthodox Jew is the most expensive lifestyle that a Jew in America can use. It was always the Reform. Now it's the modern Orthodox. So I just connecting with that. Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious.
What's your name?
Mark,
Mark, thank you. What's your name?
My name is Aaron. Do you have any data on the stuff that you've looked at that, starting with Chabad and looking at the enclave Jewish communities that you're talking about, Haredim that live in the state, that in any way, shape, or form, they've been willing to compromise on their core values? Without saying that you, without redefining what I'm asking.
So data would be an interesting way of looking at it. I think that one of the interesting things that myself and other scholars have found, both among, and some of these trends do apply to Israeli Haredi society as well. My wife is the head of the occupational therapy department at Ono College. She has two campuses. She has the campus in Kiryat Ono, which is a mixed heterogeneous campus, and she has a campus where there are 50 Haredi girls learning, women, mostly married, learning occupational therapy in 10 minutes away. And they have men's days and women's days. So, so getting back to this question, it would seem to me that you have to look at it this way, that there is a rhetoric and there is a reality.
Just repeat the question.
What's your name?
Well, my name is Aaron, but I can already see from where my question is, you made a recommendation for mixed communities who have multi-generational communities that start with different ideas of how committed they are to, say, Zionism, okay, that would need to work stuff out. And you ended the statement by saying that there would be a lot of work and need for compromise. Okay? What I'm trying to get at is that what you described historically and the ascension, the exponential growth in the Haredi community, okay, true, there's a reality testing where they've gone beyond, but in the book at least you describe that, and within Chabad, the hierarchy is that if you're born in Chabad and you're not a Baal Tshuva, having lived in Chabad community, there is a clear unwritten difference in shidduchim between somebody who's born part of the upper hierarchy, and they don't compromise on those kinds of things. And the idea that these communities have enlarged, when it comes down to the kinds of compromises that would need to be made, it seems that those kinds of compromises is not intrinsic to the growth, starting back with they wanted to live by themselves, they didn't want to be part of the United States, they didn't want to be part of Orthodox Judaism. So I'm just trying to understand. Okay,
so first of all, thank you. It's a wonderful and thoughtful question, and I can't say I'll answer it, but I'll try to engage it, okay? Because I think it's very, very important, but it's very nuanced, and that's why it's not going to be a black and white answer. I'm just saying from the get-go. Is that when I said rhetoric versus reality, maybe I shouldn't just say rhetoric, but it also might point to certain specific areas in which there is still a lot of commitment to a certain old ideals. So if we look at Israeli society, for example, what you'll see is that certainly among Haredi men, even if lots of them are learning in law school or a business school in Ono or in Machon Lev or in other programs, it's after they're married. So there's this big difference between pre-shidduch and post-shidduch. But that doesn't mean broadly that things aren't changing, and it doesn't mean that if people are eventually going to college that their children are going to be the same. In other words, you don't reproduce once there's the same environment, once there's that. So now, regarding Chabad, I've studied a lot of Chabad, and if you've read some of the book, then you know that. And Shluchim are elites. In other words, the way it works in Chabad is that the elite are the Shluchim. Last week they had the convention. The people were sent out as the messengers, as the emissaries of the Rebbe. That is the ideal for Chabad. And there's a lot of debate about who is being sent out. Are Mashiachistim being sent out, or is it only There's a whole internal discussion there. But if you spend time with Shluchim, they may want their children to have Shidduchim with children of Shluchim, etc. But they are not enclavists in any way, shape, or form. Not in the way that they conduct their homes, and not in the way that they educate their children. Now, I want to show you how this works. It's very complicated. I have a master's student she's a Chabad. She lives in Kfar Chabad. Very, very interesting and thoughtful young married woman who did a master's on children of Shluchim, and she interviewed children of Shluchim from Russia, from the Far East, from different parts of Western Europe. And it was really interesting to see the way they navigate between engaging the community, yes, being part of the community, being outsiders, sort of like missionaries, but much more part of things. And yes, they do go to internet school, right? You're familiar with Chabad Internet School. There are 3 different areas of the world, and children of Shluchim get up in the morning. They sit in front of a screen. There's a classroom. There's a teacher somewhere. There's one in Spanish, one in Hebrew, and one in English. And they don't have to go to the local schools. And later in high school, they'll be sent to either to Brooklyn or to Melbourne. Okay. Having said that, they're very involved, and the people that they're exposed to at their Shabbos table, and the people that they're the kids' friends. So it's not exactly like modern Orthodox. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's not exactly what I'm trying to say. And that's just the Chabad example. Similarly, if you look at people in the Haredi world who have gone out of their enclaves, certainly they'll send their kids back to Lakewood, they'll send their kids to Tells, they'll send their kids to Baltimore for yeshiva, even for high school, etc. But in terms of the way their homes work, in terms of the types of shuls they attend, in terms of the exposure and the engagement with the broader community, it's completely different than what those people had when they were living in the tighter community. Just one more point, and then we'll move on, and I hope at some level I touched on some things. And that is that I lost my train of thought for a second. I'll leave it at that. I'll get back to it. Go ahead. What's your name?
My name is Shlomo.
Hi, Shlomo.
I'm not sure what preparation you were given, from from Daniel. Certainly in the closing minutes of your presentation, I think you did a good job of giving context to some of the things that are going on here. But by placing them within larger trends, it suggests that the Marbe Ella, our shul is one of many in the world that are going through similar types of transitions. And you said some enticing things towards the end about creativity is needed. Can you give examples that you're familiar with other communities that have dealt with these kinds of things successfully? And
your name again?
Shlomo.
Shlomo. Okay, so I I think that my role, and I think it's a very important role, but it's a limited one, is it's sort of like more, I don't know if you ever go to, there's psychologists here?
Yes, the rabbi.
So, the rabbi. So when people go to group therapy, it's not to talk themselves, it's to hear other people talking about their things and realize it's not exactly like theirs, but maybe it can help them think about themselves. So when you look at historical models and you look at trends, it's not to say, oh, it's exactly what's going on here, but it generates thought. You go, is that relevant? Is that, in other words, that I think is how I understood what we were doing here. But getting to the more specific issue, that's a fantastic question. To be honest, at least from what was described to me, this is a very, I would say, I can think of other communities that have similar things, but to the degree where there was a very strong core that established a community and a quite cohesive group that's really the age of most of the core people's children, right? Or many of the core people's children who have strengthened the shul in numbers, but come from a different generation, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, it's more likely to be an Israeli phenomenon because of Aliyah. You don't usually have a community. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit. I'm about to say something really harsh. Okay? So I apologize. Please. Okay? Which is that when those things happen, unless people really work hard, we know what the end result is. They split. And when the things that keep people from splitting unless they really work hard is finance. It's true. I mean, I look at conservative schools all over America where there were two major suburban conservative schools in an area, and they close down and they merge because there aren't enough members. Here, there's a richness of membership, a richness of Jews. The question is richness of membership. But when I say that it takes a lot of compromise because it's so easy, we all know the old joke, the guy was stranded on the desert island, his house, oh, that's my shul, that's a shul, I would never step foot in that shul, right? So, in other words, to find models where people, where there was clearly two groups and they were able to cultivate, I think is fascinating to think about. I hate to say it, I think it's something that is so worth working on. Yeah, but I can't say that I have an answer. The rabbi wants to say something about it.
The brief thing, which I'm troubled by I'm in these discussions, I'm always troubled by the word compromise, which suggests a zero-sum game. I'm looking for a model of creativity and mutual enrichment where the whole thing grows.
Why are you troubled by the word compromise?
Both sides are giving up.
Right. It means I would really like to have this, and you would really like to have that. So I'll take away a little, you'll take away a little. We'll both have something that's less.
Well, maybe I'll give okay. So if we were talking on an interpersonal level, so you have two people who are married to each other, and one of them really likes classical music, right? And one of them, or not at all, right?
Right.
Now, then you have to decide how much do they really love classical music, and how much does it bother me? That's a silly thing, but the illustration is. So you look. It's compromise is not saying I give up on what's important to me when it's the most crucial thing, and it's how do you find things? You say I look at somebody, I care very much about them, I want to be connected with them. And I say, wow, that's really important to this person. Will it really hurt me to allow that? And the opposite. It doesn't mean that I say I'm just going to let them, steamroll over me. It has to be some level of zen and zen. If it's,
Right.
I think the rabbi wants to say something.
It's not to the fact that I want more questions afterwards, so don't misinterpret my standing here, because I also felt there was a lot of food for thought with the lecture, not only the concluding remarks, but just like Shlomo, and that's why I was very happy with your question, because I planned even before you asked the question to make this comment that I'm making now, because you really. The last 5 minutes, I think, were so much on target, in my humble eyes, about what's going on here in our show. And I must say, first of all, and my comment is very short, very banal, not chidush, maybe a psychologist remark, but I think that yeda ze koach, meaning understanding. First of all, understanding that. Let's say if a young family, Ivrit or Bnei Akiva is not a sanctified value, that doesn't mean that they're not Zionists. They just came at a different time and grew up at a different time, etc. And on the contrary, if a Vatik family, Hebrew and Bnei Akiva is sanctified, that doesn't mean that it's Avodah Zarah B'Shituf. That means that they're really Zionists the way they grew up. Now, the minute both sides, and again, it's big generalizations, not all young families are like that, and not all old Vatikim are like that, but the minute that there is a mutual understanding of this, just understanding, that is already a very, very key factor, because both sides understand each other and when they come for, and both sides can respect what's very, very important for others. If we go to the classic music and therefore I see a lot of hope in this. And you say it requires a hard work, but I think there is a lot of hope and future in this, because there is a common ground, and that's the religious Zionism. There is a big, solid common ground. That's A. B, I want to say, and that's from my perspective, as an Israeli that was born in Israel, his parents were born in Israel, parallel phenomena for parallel and different reasons, and we can talk about it maybe now you're going to Charleston, but when they'll have time, happen also with the generation gap within Israeli society, meaning the Zionism of my parents is different a little bit than the Zionism of me. Specifically with my example, it's different because of my specific father. But last Shabbat I wasn't here. My father-in-law had his 80th birthday. That's why I was away. He grew up as a Bnei Akiva, Mizrochnik, very, very clear, solid. And my kids went to Steinsaltz, meaning I'm you all know me, I'm a Zionist, but it's different. It's still different in many, many parallel ways. If you look at and especially even people that are younger than me, it's different than the generation of their parents. So I see, even without the immigration factor, this thing. Okay, I'm there. Yeah.
I just make a comment that it seems to me that biology is deriving a lot of things. One is biological, biological and sociological. Derives a lot of things that are going to happen. For one thing, if you have a larger population, you'll have more specialization within the population. You'll have different groups involved, and there'll be conflict between in some way or other. We see that in cities, Israeli cities, fewer Haredim and
I remember.
The other just the other biological thing is that old people tend, in general, to die. And young people tend, in general, to have children.
If you'll allow me, there's something I was going to say before, but you sharpened it, and I want to say this as an outsider, that I'm old enough to realize that appreciating the efforts of people when it wasn't as easy as it is for me is a religious value. And it's not, it belittles it to just say, oh, it's derech eretz, be derech eretz, you know? If you're creating a religious community and you want it to be a place of avodat Hashem in the totality of what we consider to be avodat Hashem, that's what I'm talking about compromise. I'm talking about, it's not necessarily saying I have to be less religious, or it's saying in my religious worldview, finding ways to show appreciation for the efforts of people who came before me is a value. It's something I want to teach my children. It's something I want to communicate. It's something that I would like to be a part of a religious organization where that is a value. I don't know if you would call it a value, but I think that people who have established frameworks, sounds a little bit weird, but they have to be mature enough to know that synagogues aren't about ownership, and that when people start to self-understand themselves as the owners of a religious makom tefillah and makom limud and makom avodat Hashem, then we have an undermining of what a religious institution is about. That's also the type of compromise that is a point of departure for then thinking, well, I have a deep connection to this place because I built it, or I was part of it, and my children grew up here. I appreciate what this place is, and I recognize that there are people whose connection is it's existential to who they are. But I also want to be in a place where I like the davening, and where I think my kids will learn and grow as Ovdei Hashem. But those are part of what it means to be a religious person. I'm not talking as a professor now or a sociologist. I'm talking about my understanding of that spectrum, and I think it's something like it's in certain ways. I think that besides having scholars come in and talk about broad trends and thinking of how this place fits in, or to what degree this is a sort of a laboratory, which it is in a way. But I think that it's also good to think about the areas of avodat Hashem that can be challenged by certain types of intergenerational conflicts, and maybe learning svarim or having shiurim about topics. They always say about a certain rabbi who, no matter what he talked about in his drasha, he'd always get to that same thing, whether it's Lashon Hara, or whether it was, Kibbut Avim, or whether it was, not talking in shul, or whether it was learning Torah. Every rabbi had their thing. And everyone was, what did the rabbi talk about? But if you talk about it enough, people start to internalize it. I think that a shul is a place where those things can happen if people, if those kind of shiurim take place, because what a shiur Torah does is says, this is part of Torah. This is part of what it means to be a religious person. And there are lots of topics on that. I just want to say to you about the Haredi community, what I meant to say before is that the Balei Tshuva have had a very strong effect on the heterogeneity as well, where it doesn't affect the Shidduchim, where there's a hierarchy, where someone might not want their child to marry a famous singer, a Banai, right? I think one of them lives in Ramot, but nonetheless, the Banais are part of the Haredi community. So it's created, but I don't want to get into it. I just there more.
It's a 30-second plug to things, which one special also for our next lecture, which is balancing integrity, community, and pluralism. I think it might be a little more practical towards that.
Well done.
Sure.
I don't know what world I live in, but Sal is in for a shul where there's tremendous conflict between two groups of people, and I don't see it around me.
Because we don't talk to them.
What?
We don't talk to them.
We've internalized the rabbi's message about Lashon Hara, so that's why.
We don't talk to them because they're not on see it, but the fact is, when we see them, I mean, there's no, you take the critics, you get the impression that we're at each other's throats. But the fact is, I don't feel that way at all. I don't think most of your people, the young people sitting here feel that. We have a little bit of differences in approach and so on, but we've never met together, we've never discussed these things, we haven't had fights. What's going on here?
If I understand correctly what you're saying, that the modern generation today, Zionism is less of a religious value than what it was for like a generation, 2 generations ago, or a generation ago.
Just a second. I want to be able to hear you.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly,
That's one point that I
that's one of the last point, and I'm saying like people who are making Aliyah to a certain degree are more looking for like a Jewish neighborhood, which might be in America, but it works out well to be in Israel.
Not quite, but okay. Yeah.
Not quite. So that's the point I'm trying to. Practically, where does that turn out? Most of the people who I know, who I think fit into this Hagdara, are pro-army, are pro-work, are pro-job, and I understand the subtlety or the differentiation thing. Is this like kind of like in Chabad, is this Meshachisi or not? Like, do we believe this cult of the Geula, or do we not? But like, where does this practically come?
I think in a synagogue, it's a great question. My understanding is that in a synagogue where our religion has a lot of things where we get used to things that we feel our comfort zones. Religion is synagogue is in a place where people want to be in their comfort zone, and it's also in a place, and sometimes hypocritically, where people who attend to express their most elitist or ideal understandings of how religion should be practiced. A lot of people who are in their businesses or in their homes or on their vacations or in their everyday life might not be so strict about things. When they get to synagogue, there's this urge to sort of be very, not to know Hilchot Kriyat HaTorah and to correct the Baal Koreh because they did something that if they knew Hebrew, they would correct it. You know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. So I think what that does is that it tends to cause people who might be more willing to allow for variety to exist in other situations to become entrenched in what they consider to be the right religious behavior.
Can you give like a practical example of something?
So I don't know what goes on here, but in other communities, so sometimes it'll be things like the height of the mechitza. So you could see a tshuva of Rav Moshe and yell, but that was b'diavad. Okay, so then the question becomes, why do you want to make a fight about that mechitza? Because you really think that the mechitza is not halachic, or because it's a power struggle and it's a way to impose your ideal religious perception on everybody else? So that would be a classic example. Another might be even something that has to do with nusach or repeating words in the tefillah, or there are all sorts of opportunities in prayer for people to sort of.
But none of these things necessarily have to do with that.
No, I don't think that has to do with
but if
Zionism.
somebody's if you send your kid to a Haredi yeshiva, I'm not talking. This is not a personal discussion. I'm just answering your question. The issue is that if somebody goes to a Haredi school that doesn't believe in kids getting a high school degree or going to the army because they're sending them to a school because they get a better yeshiva education.
That wasn't my question.
No, but it's an answer. But that is a manifestation. Somebody could come here and say that they want to they want to live in this community because there are resources available that might be divergent from what other people in the community believe.
I thought that interchange was much more interesting than anything I said. But but having said that, I think for some people, and I don't know where you stand in this, but for some people, if there's Tfilat Yom Ha'atzmaut and all the young people don't show up, it's very offensive. There you go.
No hints.
I think that I imagine if once upon a time in this shul it was clear that I know in the shul my in-law where my wife grew up in Young Israel Forest Hills, many Holocaust survivors. Besides the Amim Noraim, the most packed service of the year was when they lit who would light the 6 candles in the special memorial, and if it wasn't well attended, people would take visceral offense. So I don't know if that's the case particularly here on Yom Ha'atzmaut, but it would be an example where that could cause people to sense we're not in the same world. Yeah.
I just want to say, touching upon what the Rav said and what you brought up, our differences are much fewer than the issues of even friction that could come up. It's for the newer families that moved in here. Thank God there are a lot of shuls in the area, and that some other new families go to and some don't. And the ones that are here tonight and the ones that died in the shul are here because our values, or at least we feel, intertwine with the values that the Vatikim, created this community for. So yes, there could be minor differences, and certainly with our fundamental beliefs or our ideals or values about Zionism per maybe one, but I think that all of us who come to this shul, as opposed to any of the other 4 or 5 different within 5-minute walk of here, it's because we want these values for our families as well. And yes, there are small differences, but I think that the common ground is much greater than those.
Why don't we? Do you think? Where's Daniel? 1 or 2 more comments, and then or keep going. Okay. So why don't we? I keep going. For some reason, I keep going this side, that side. It's like no. Go ahead, please.
I think there are 2 particular issues for schools like this. The approach to tackle and the mentioned. One is the issue of going to the army or not going, not in theory, but in practice, going to the army. So the second one is the issue of language. Whether the schools here, the people who come to Israel, if they speak Hebrew in the shul, and the general policy, if it's a lecture like this, or English.
השירות הצבאי שלי היה קשה ואני מאוד גאה במה שעשיתי, ולגבי השפה אני אשמח לנהל את הדיון בעברית, אבל אמרו לי לדבר באנגלית, אז דיברתי באנגלית. Okay. Well, but can you speak English, please, and then I understand you?
He speaks English.
Language. I don't know what an issue is. Sorry, another person. So, it's just interesting to me. I don't know if I got it right. But wait. I want to know. Does it matter to you if you daven next to someone who went to the army or who sends their kids to the army or not?
It does.
I'm interested.
I'm pointing out to you 2 points, 2 issues which are very divisive.
But explain how they're divisive.
I'll explain how they're divisive. For those who are born in Israel, who've been here 40, 50 years, almost all of them see it as a point of principle that they go to the army, or the older, they encourage their kids to go to the army. Whereas people who come, say, in the 90s, quite a lot of them do not go to the army as a fact. And the difference between those who do go to the army and those who do not go to the army is a point of friction.
You still didn't explain why it's a point of friction. It's a point of friction because people who went to the army.
People do go to the army frown on those who do not send the kids to the army or don't go to the army.
So therefore,
I have my life on the line. Why does it be?
And therefore, to daven in the same shul as those people is offensive to you. I don't know. How does it cause conflict? I really want to understand.
It's a core value of the shul.
So therefore, it's interesting to me. That would cause conflict. What people do in their private lives is their decision, isn't it?
I've been to most of the old timers in the shul. It is bothersome when people came and do not see it as a valuable life to go to the army, and they told them it was not to go to the army. So they bothered a lot of people. Deeply.
I've been here for 16 years.
I'm happy that a woman's
This is something actually that I thought about using the word compromise. And the word compromise, people think means, I want to do this, you want to do that, and we have to change, each one of us to give up something to meet in the middle. But I think what's very important here in shul and these groups and these values is the word acceptance and lack of fear. The lack of fear of newcomers, new ideas. You have to accept everyone for who they are, and job next to them, who cares, and let them have the union that they want, adopt how they want. And we have to accept the older community is accepting the younger community, and no one has to feel that the other side compromise. And we love.
I just feel like some people are getting restless. So unless, Rabbi, you wanted to say something, you should have the last word. But I think it would be better if people want to talk, probably. But maybe I'll just say one thing before the Rabbi has the last word. That again, I hope that throughout, it's very important to me to say this, is that I hope I'm respectful, because I think this is what I said the first thing it's an amazing thing that a community is trying to be introspective, and it's like, take a walk on the wild side. It's a little dangerous, right? Because when you take the worms out, having said that, I think between the rhetoric of, I don't know what the problem is, and some of the other things that I heard, there is some spectrum here, and I think it would be really wonderful if the community could grow together in a way where people feel connected as much as in the visceral way that clearly the founders do. And it seems to me that there's a lot of goodwill here, and I hope it'll happen, because I hope I didn't hurt the chances. I hope they did. So, Rabbi, please.
No, actually, what I had to say, I said already. It's now a minor remark, just commenting on what Aaron now said and trying to I don't know if that's what you meant, but I want to. It is, and that's like a parenthetical remark. It's not what I said before was what was important for me to say. What I'm saying now is mamash, a footnote, but perhaps an important footnote. I think the issue of serving in the army and not serving in the army is not necessarily has to do with Vatikim and Chadashim. It's between the Vatikims and between the Chadashim. So that's not the point. But I'll just say that, and I'm saying that to, Americans in general, as an Israeli, that whereas sometimes people make aliyah, and they say, I don't understand the differences. Here in Israel, there's such a clear fragmentation between Tzionim and Haredim, and I'm for Achdus, and I love everybody, and I want to create now an organization in the neighborhood that everyone will be together, and all kinds of stuff like that. So, yes, I think that just like you said, that there was a parallel process in Israeli society, that the Haredim are not that Haredim and that Tzionim are not that Tzion. I think differences and similarities, and that's a topic for another lecture. But having said that, still, when my son, and now I'm speaking personally, is a big Talmid Chacham, I learn with him P'tzot HaChoshen once a week, Chavrusa, and is risking his life, and my cousin was killed in the Lebanon War, and I know that another group are not attending, generally speaking, the army cemeteries. So it's harder for me to speak about let's hug each other and be in Achdus. That's a difference between America and Israel. And just people should be aware of that. That's what I'm saying. That's what we need to say here, just for knowledge, because when I speak with Olim, some of them sometimes fail to understand this point or don't fully internalize it, or internalize that the place that they will send their kid to learn, even in first grade, but definitely in 8th grade and 9th grade, many times is a predictive factor to whether he will serve in the army or not serve in the army. And then there's going to be a certain gap. I mean, I love everyone. My best friends here are Haredim, Mamash, here in Israel, and I have relatives. And still, this will always stay as a source of tension, and it's understood that it is. That's my little remark here regarding this. Okay.
Go ahead. Thank you, speaker.
You have a rabbi, and you
You're absolutely right.
It's about identity. It's also about not being